I remember the weight of the autogun in my hands, not its physical mass, but the spiritual gravity of what it represented. 3 kilograms of pressed metal and synthetic components that separated me from the skeletal figures beyond the wire. 3 kilograms that meant the difference between a full belly and joining the corpses that littered the dusty approaches to Silo 7. My name was Matthias Keln, and for 11 months I stood watch over grain while the world starved. I fired into crowds. I killed men I'd grown up beside. I murdered my own family to protect food that was never meant for human mouths. But I should start at the beginning, when I still believed the lies. The famine came in its 3rd year when I accepted the position. Agri-world Secundus Theta had always been marginal, a dust-choked planet where massive cultivation zones stretched across continents, tended by billions of agricultural workers who lived in sprawling settlements between the grain seas. The administratum designated us as priority classification, food production, which meant every seed, every drop of water, every calorie of output was calculated generations in advance to meet the imperial tithe. We grew enough grain to feed 100 worlds. We exported everything. Even in good years, we ate corpse starch and protein paste while our harvests filled void ships bound for systems we'd never see. Then the blight came, a fungal infection that turned golden wheat black in the fields, spreading faster than burnback crews could contain it. Within a season, 40% of our yield rotted. The administratum response was immediate and terrible. Increase quotas to compensate for the loss. The tithe ships would arrive on schedule, and they expected their cargo holds filled regardless of local conditions. If we couldn't meet production standards, the planet would be reclassified, a bureaucratic term that meant orbital bombardment and replacement of the workforce with something more efficient. So they harvested everything. Fields that should have been left to recover were stripped to the root. Seed reserves meant for next year's planting went into the tithe holds. The grain we usually kept for local consumption, the minimal allocation that prevented complete starvation, was requisitioned. The administratum officers, speaking through vox amplifiers with voices that echoed across our settlement squares, proclaimed that sacrifice was holy duty. They alleged the emperor demanded our devotion. They claimed he protected those who served loyally. They lied with every transmitted word. I was 34 years old when the recruitment notices appeared on every street corner. Hunger guard positions available. Full rations. Hosing. Protection for immediate family. The propaganda picts showed strong men in clean uniforms standing proud before the great silos. Defenders of the imperial food supply, servants of a higher purpose. What they didn't show were the firing lines, the bodies, the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. My father had been a harvester operator for 40 years, guiding the massive machines that crawled across the grain seas, swallowing stalks and producing compressed food bricks. He'd raised me and my 2 brothers, Cale and Thomas, in a small habitation unit near the eastern cultivation zones. Mother was never spoken of. Father said she died in an equipment accident when I was too young to remember. And we honored her memory by keeping her name in our evening devotions to the God Emperor, though those prayers never felt like anything more than ritual repetition. Words we'd been conditioned to speak before meals, empty sounds that preceded the distribution of food. By the time I was old enough to work, I joined a maintenance crew that serviced the irrigation networks. Kilometers of piping that drew water from deep aquifers to spray across the endless fields. It was honest labor. Difficult, exhausting, but I took pride in keeping the systems functional. I'd married young. A man named Joseph from the processing facilities, an arrangement made by our fathers to strengthen family labor allotments. We had 2 sons, Petir, 9 years old, and Mikhail, 6. They were thin even before the famine, living on minimal rations like everyone else, but they laughed. They played in the dust between the habitation blocks. They had a childhood, limited as it was. When the blight took hold and the real starvation began, Yosef's facility reduced its workforce by 80%. Bodies didn't process grain, machines did. and machines didn't need feeding. Joseph came home one evening with hollow eyes and termination documents stamped with the administrative seal. Our family ration allocation dropped to quarter strength, 1,200 calories per day split between 4 people. I watched my sons' faces become skull-like, their eyes too large, their movements increasingly lethargic as their bodies consumed themselves for energy. The Hunger Guard recruitment promised salvation, 3,000 calories daily for the Guard, full standard rations for immediate family, guaranteed housing in the protected zones near the silos. I stood in front of that propaganda poster for an hour, reading it repeatedly, calculating the mathematics of survival. My family was dying. The choice was already made before I consciously acknowledged it. I reported to the recruitment station in the administrative district, a reinforced structure surrounded by security barriers where well-fed officials processed desperate men by the hundreds. The line stretched for blocks, skeletal figures clutching recruitment notices like sacred texts, their desperation thick enough to taste. I noticed everyone in line was male, drawn from the remaining workforce population. The administratum had long since calculated that men possessed the physical strength and psychological conditioning necessary for guard work. And this world's labor distribution had always skewed heavily male in the cultivation and maintenance sectors. The processing took 6 hours. They verified my identity against the central registry, confirmed I had no disciplinary infractions, tested my vision and reflexes, and administered a loyalty examination, a series of questions about devotion to the emperor, and the imperium that had only one acceptable set of answers. I repeated the phrases they wanted to hear. I serve the God Emperor above all. The imperium's survival depends on loyal service. The tithe must be met regardless of local hardship. Each sentence felt like swallowing glass, but I spoke them with the required conviction. The examiner, a thin man with the dead eyes of someone who'd administered this test thousands of times, marked my responses as satisfactory. The Emperor protects the faithful, he said, stamping my documentation with approval. I said nothing. Even then, in my desperation, I knew those words were machinery designed to produce compliance. He didn't believe them any more than I did. They were part of the processing protocol, ritualized language that transformed starving men into weapons aimed at other starving men. They issued my equipment that same day. A flak vest marked with the silo identification number, a helmet with an attached rebreather for dust storms, an autogun with 3 charge packs, and a uniform in the dull gray of the Administrative Security Division. The autogun was simple, a kinetic weapon firing solid rounds, reliable and brutal. They gave me 30 minutes of instruction on its operation, how to load, fire, clear jams, and perform basic maintenance. The instructor, a career guard with 20 years of service and a face that looked carved from old leather, demonstrated the firing stance on a practice range where human-shaped targets stood at various distances. Center mass, he said, putting 3 rounds through the target's chest in rapid succession. You're not trying to wound, you're trying to stop forward movement. Chest shots, drop them fastest. If you hesitate, they get through the wire, and if they reach the silo doors, everyone dies. He turned to look at our training group. 15 new recruits, all hollow-eyed and motivated by the same desperate arithmetic I'd performed. Questions? We all understood. This wasn't a defense force protecting against external enemies. This was a barrier between starving people and food, and we would be the ones pulling triggers when that barrier was tested. My assignment was Silo 7, one of 43 massive grain storage facilities that ringed the primary settlement zone. Each silo was a reinforced ferrocrete cylinder, 60 meters in diameter and 40 meters tall, topped with a moisture-sealed dome. The walls were thick enough to withstand artillery strikes. Not that anyone outside the wire had access to artillery. The real threat was volume. 10,000 desperate people with bare hands could tear through secondary barriers if left unchecked. That's what we were for. The auto guns. The killing line. The silo complex included a small barracks for the guard force. 20 men on rotating shifts, and a separate habitation unit for families. They moved Joseph and my sons into a clean room with actual beds, running water, and a food dispenser that provided daily rations without fail. I saw Petir's face when he realized he could eat until he was full, the wonder and relief that spread across his features. That expression justified everything. I told myself that whatever I had to do was worth it to see my children fed. The first week of guard duty was almost peaceful. I worked the day shift, standing at one of the perimeter positions with an autogun slung across my chest, watching the empty approaches through the wire barriers. The silo zone was surrounded by 3 layers of fencing, standard security protocol intended to create distance and slow any potential breach. Beyond the outer wire, the settlement sprawled in all directions. Thousands of hab units, built from corrugated metal and compressed board, home to the cultivation workforce and their families. From my elevated position, I could see smoke from cooking fires, though I knew those fires burned mostly wood and refuse now, not food. The ration distribution centers had reduced output to near zero for the general population. People were surviving on whatever they could scavenge, supplement with vermin, or steal. The guards I worked alongside were men like me, recruited from the workforce, motivated by the same terrible necessity. We didn't speak much. There was an unspoken understanding that conversation might force us to acknowledge what we were really doing. We stood our shifts, performed the required security protocols, and returned to our quarters to eat meals that tasted like guilt. I remember the specific flavor of the rations. Compressed protein bars with a chemical sweetness, grain porridge that was thick and filling, vegetable matter processed into paste. It was nutritionally complete and utterly joyless. But it was food. Real food. More than I'd eaten in months. I gained weight. My strength returned. I watched my sons' hollow cheeks fill out, their energy return, their laughter come back. The cost seemed acceptable. That calculus changed in week 2, when the first crowd approached the wire. They came at dawn, perhaps 200 people moving together across the dusty ground between the settlement and the outer barrier. Most were men, but I saw fathers carrying young sons on their shoulders. Boys so thin they looked like bundles of sticks wrapped in cloth. They weren't armed. They weren't violent. They were just desperate, drawn to the silos by the smell of grain and the knowledge that food existed inside while they starved outside. Our shift commander, a career guard named Vecht, who'd been working silo security for a decade, activated the loudspeaker system. His voice boomed across the approach zone. This is a secured Imperial facility. Unauthorized approach is forbidden. Return to the settlement immediately or face lethal response. The crowd slowed but didn't stop. A man at the front, skeletal thin with a boy in his arms, called out, "We're not asking for much, just enough to feed the children. We know there's grain inside, please." Vecht repeated the warning, adding specific legal citations from the Administratum Security Codes. Paragraph 447, subsection 12, Protection of Imperial Resources. Paragraph 891, Lethal Force Authorization. Words designed to make murder sound like administrative necessity. The crowd continued forward, reaching the outer wire. Hands gripped the fencing, shaking it, testing its strength. The boy in the front man's arms was crying, a thin wailing sound that carried clearly in the morning air. "Warning shots," Vecht ordered. We raised our weapons and fired into the air, a crackling roar of automatic fire that split the dawn silence. The crowd flinched backward, but they didn't run. They'd crossed the threshold, where fear of death was less powerful than the certainty of starvation. When you're dying anyway, bullets lose their authority. "They're not leaving," one of the guards beside me muttered, his voice tight with something between fear and recognition. Vecht made a hand signal. I'd learned this signal in training. Prepare to fire for effect. Aimed shots, center mass, controlled burst patterns to conserve ammunition. My hands moved automatically, bringing the autogun to my shoulder, sighting down the barrel at the mass of people beyond the wire. My finger rested on the trigger. 3 kilograms of pressure. That's all that separated me from becoming a murderer. Fire. The word was quiet, almost conversational. 20 autoguns opened up simultaneously, pouring rounds into the crowd at 200 meters. Bodies jerked and fell. Blood misted in the dry air. The sound was tremendous, a mechanical roaring punctuated by screaming. I squeezed my trigger in controlled bursts, like I'd been taught watching my rounds punch through the torso of a man clutching the wire. He dropped, sliding down the fencing, leaving a red smear. The boy he'd been carrying tumbled into the dust. The crowd broke and ran, leaving dozens on the ground. Some weren't dead yet, crawling or writhing in the dirt. Vetched let them suffer for 30 seconds, long enough for the lesson to be clear, before ordering a second volley to finish the wounded. Cease fire. Stand ready. My hands were shaking. I realized I was breathing rapidly, almost hyperventilating, the rebreather mask creating a rhythmic hissing that matched my pulse. I'd just killed people, multiple people. Men I didn't know, but who shared my world, my suffering, my desperation. The only difference between us was which side of the wire we stood on. Recovery team to Sector 7, Vecht said into his Vox communicator. Casualty clearance required. Within an hour, a crew arrived in an open-bed transport truck. They wore simple coveralls and worked with the efficiency of long practice, gathering bodies and loading them into the truck bed like cordwood. I learned later these crews worked constantly, clearing corpses from all 43 silos and transporting them to the processing facilities. Nothing was wasted on an agricultural world. The bodies would be rendered into protein components and added to the corpse starch rations. The people who'd tried to reach the grain would become food themselves, consumed by the same population they'd belonged to. The calculus of survival on Agri-World Secundus Theta was perfectly closed. Starve or eat your own dead. The administratum called it resource efficiency. That night, I couldn't eat. Joseph noticed, asking with concern if I was feeling ill. I lied and said I was fine, just tired from standing watch in the heat. My sons ate their rations without awareness, telling me about their day in the protected zone, where other guards' children played simple games and attended basic educational instruction. Patir was learning the Imperial Catechism, the ritualized questions and answers about loyalty, duty, and the God Emperor's supposed protection. They alleged he watched over faithful servants. They claimed devotion ensured salvation. They programmed children with comfortable lies to create the next generation of compliant workers. I listened to my son repeat the phrases and felt something crack inside my chest. He believed them. He was 9 years old and genuinely believed that some distant corpse god on a throne light years away cared about his survival. The propaganda had taken root in his mind with the simple faith of childhood. I wanted to tell him the truth, that the Emperor was dead or indifferent, that we were alone, that faith was just another tool of control. But what would that truth cost him? Better, perhaps, to let him keep the comforting delusion, at least for now. I reported for duty the next day and the day after. The crowds came less frequently once word spread about the shooting, but they still came. Desperation is more powerful than fear when death is certain either way. By the end of my first month, I'd participated in 7 separate incidents. My personal kill count, if I'd been keeping track, which I wasn't, was probably between 15 and 20 people. It became mechanical. Target acquisition. Controlled burst. Assess for continuing threat. Next target. I stopped seeing them as individuals and started seeing them as movement patterns, threat assessments, security problems to be neutralized. The autogun became an extension of my body. I learned its quirks. The slight pull to the left after sustained fire, the tendency for the charging mechanism to stick in dust storms, the precise angle needed to clear a jam efficiently. I cleaned it every night before sleeping, performing the maintenance rituals the instructor had taught us. Apply lubricant to the moving parts, check the firing pin for wear. verify the charge pack connections. The Mechanicus texts called these maintenance procedures appeasing the machine spirit, framing basic mechanical function as communion with some embedded consciousness. I knew better. The weapon had no spirit. It was metal and synthetic components assembled to perform a specific function. When I maintained it properly, it functioned properly. When I didn't, it jammed. Simple causation, not divine favor. But I noticed other guards treating their weapons with genuine reverence, whispering prayers before applying lubricant, making the sign of the Aquila over the receiver housing. They'd been conditioned since childhood to conflate technology with theology, to see machinery as sacred rather than functional. It was easier, perhaps, to believe your weapon was blessed than to accept you were just a murderer with good maintenance habits. Month 3 brought the first personal recognition. I was standing post on the eastern perimeter when a smaller group approached the wire, maybe 20 people, moving slowly, clearly weakened. They stopped at the outer barrier without touching it, having learned from previous incidents that physical contact prompted immediate lethal response. A voice called out, "Matthias! Matthias Keln! Is that you?" I recognized the speaker. Grevin. We'd worked together on the irrigation maintenance crews for 6 years. He'd been a good worker, reliable and skilled, someone I'd shared rations with during repair shifts in the far cultivation zones. I hadn't seen him since accepting the guard position. Grevin. I kept my weapon lowered but ready. You need to step back from the wire. We're not causing trouble, Matthias. We just want to talk. To ask. He gestured at the group behind him. All men, all skeletal. We know you're just doing your duty, we understand. But there's grain in there, enough to feed the planet for years. They're loading tithe ships while we starve. Doesn't that seem wrong to you? It seemed profoundly wrong. It seemed like the cruelest mathematics of oppression. But acknowledging that wouldn't change anything. The tithe must be met, I said, repeating the phrase from the loyalty examination. It's not my decision, I'm just security. You're Keln, Grevin said quietly. I know your family. Your father trained my brother on the harvesters. Your son, Petir, played with my nephew before. He stopped, not finishing the sentence. Before the nephew died of starvation, presumably. I can't help you, I said. Each word felt like broken glass in my throat. If you approach the wire, I'll have to shoot. Orders. Orders. Grevin laughed, a bitter sound. The administratum gives orders. The priests say the emperor protects. They tell us sacrifice is holy duty. But it's all lies, isn't it? The emperor isn't protecting us. He's dead. Or might as well be. And we're dying for a tithe that feeds worlds we'll never see, while our children eat dirt. Vetcht's voice crackled through the vox bead in my ear. Keln, disperse that group, or I'm authorizing lethal response. I raised my voice. You need to leave now. I can't protect you if you stay. Grevin held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes the exact moment he chose. The moment when continuing to live like this seemed worse than the alternative. He placed both hands on the wire and began to climb. The others in his group started forward, following his lead. I fired. Center mass. Controlled burst. Grevin jerked backward, sliding down the wire, leaving bloody handprints. The others scattered under sustained fire from the entire guard line. Within seconds, it was over. 14 bodies on the ground, the rest running back toward the settlement. I had murdered a man I'd worked beside for 6 years, a man who'd shared meals with me, who'd known my family, who'd been right about everything he'd said. That night, I vomited until my stomach was empty. Joseph found me in the barrack sanitation unit, heaving up bile and ration paste, my body rejecting food, while my mind rejected what I'd become. What happened? He put a hand on my shoulder, concern evident in his voice. Nothing, I said. Just something I ate that didn't agree with me. Another lie. The truth was impossible to speak. I'd eaten friendship, loyalty, and basic humanity, and my soul was vomiting them back up. By month 6, the death toll at Silo 7 alone exceeded 2,000. Across all 43 silos, the number was probably close to 90,000. The administratum called it security enforcement. The population called it massacre. The difference was only perspective. We were killing our own people to protect food that was never meant for us, and we did it every single day. The composition of the crowds changed as the famine deepened. Early on, they'd been predominantly men, workers who'd lost positions, fathers desperate to feed families. But as the months passed and the dying accelerated, the demographics shifted. More children appeared in the crowds, either accompanying adults or foraging independently. The administratum's population calculations were brutal in their honesty. Children consumed fewer calories and represented future labor potential. Therefore, they died last in any resource allocation crisis. The adult male workforce, the current labor force, received priority until they were no longer functional. Then they were discarded and resources redistributed to whatever remained. I never fired on children. I couldn't. Whenever I saw a boy in the approaching crowds, I aimed deliberately high or to the side, wasting ammunition but preserving what little remained of my conscience. Other guards did the same. We never discussed it, but I noticed the pattern. The kill ratios dropped when children were present. We were murderers, but we weren't quite monsters yet. Vetched noticed. He pulled me aside after a shift in month 7. Your ammunition expenditure is 20% higher than average, he said, scrolling through efficiency reports on a data slate. Your hit ratio is correspondingly lower. Why? I said nothing. What answer could I give that wouldn't result in disciplinary action? I see. He deactivated the slate. Let me give you some advice, Kel. You're thinking like a father instead of a guard. That's understandable, but not sustainable. Every round you waste on warning shots is a round unavailable when you really need it. Every target you miss deliberately is a breach risk. This facility processes 800,000 tons of grain. Do you know what happens if the outer barriers are compromised? If people reach the silo doors, they breach containment, I recited from the training manual. Food stocks are compromised. The tithe is endangered. Incorrect. Vecht stepped closer, his voice dropping. If they breach containment, the administratum authorizes lethal suppression at scale. They'll deploy the Arbites from the district headquarters with heavy weapons and gas dispersal systems. They'll kill everyone within a kilometer of this facility, including the settlement blocks where your former neighbors live. Thousands dead in hours instead of dozens dead in days. You think you're being merciful by missing deliberately? You're actually putting more people at risk. The logic was airtight and utterly monstrous. I was part of a system designed to gradually bleed the population while preventing catastrophic intervention that would kill even more. My murders were actually mercy killings by comparison to what would happen if I failed to murder enough people. The Emperor protects those who serve efficiently, Vetched said, repeating the propaganda phrase with the rote delivery of someone who'd said it thousands of times without ever believing it. Stay efficient, Keln. He walked away, leaving me to process the full horror of my position. I wasn't protecting grain. I was protecting people from worse deaths by killing them in smaller numbers. The calculus of oppression was so perfect, so thoroughly optimized, that even resistance served the system's interests. I stopped deliberately missing. Month 9 brought personal catastrophe. I reported for duty one morning to find Vetched waiting at the guard station with a prioritized Vox message from the settlement administration. My father had died 3 days prior. Starvation and systemic failure. His body had been processed according to standard protocols. There would be no memorial service. The administratum had banned public gatherings to prevent organization and resistance. I was granted 4 hours personal leave to return to his habitation unit and collect any possessions of value. I walked through the settlement in full guard uniform, autoguns slung across my chest. People saw me coming and moved aside, pressing themselves against walls or stepping into doorways to avoid proximity. I was the enemy now. The murderer in grey who protected grain while they starved. Children stared at me with huge eyes, and I wondered if Petir or Mikhail would have looked at me with that same expression of fear and hatred if they'd been outside the wire instead of safely fed inside. Father's habitation unit was exactly as I remembered. A single room, 12 square meters, with a sleeping mat in one corner and a small shrine to the emperor above it. The shrine was simple, a printed image of a man in golden armor, clearly imperial propaganda, surrounded by small offerings, polished stones, dried flowers from before the blight. A worn copy of the imperial infantryman's uplifting primer that someone had given him decades ago. I looked at the shrine and felt nothing. No spiritual connection, no sense of comfort. Father had prayed at this shrine every evening for as long as I could remember, reciting the catechisms he'd been taught as a child. The emperor protects the faithful. Duty is its own reward. Serve loyally and be rewarded in his sight. He believed those words genuinely, and they'd given him comfort through decades of exhausting labor, in service to an imperium that considered him a renewable resource. The emperor had not protected him. Duty's only reward had been death by starvation. Loyal service had earned him nothing but a spot in the rendering facilities, where his body would be processed into food for people who would also die serving the same lies. I dismantled the shrine, taking down the image and the primer, leaving the offerings scattered. It felt like desecration and liberation simultaneously. Father had died believing. I refused to honor that belief by maintaining the tools of his indoctrination. My brothers were already dead. Cale to an industrial accident 2 years prior, Thomas to the famine 4 months ago. I was the last of my family line outside the wire. The only family I had left was Joseph and my sons, and they existed only because I'd become a murderer. I returned to duty and killed 3 more people that afternoon. I don't remember their faces. Month 10 arrived with a dust storm that lasted 6 days, reducing visibility to less than 10 meters and covering everything in a fine layer of gray particulate. We stood our shifts in full rebreather gear, watching the approaches through optical enhancers that turned the swirling dust into ghostly green landscapes. The crowds didn't come during the storm. Movement in that kind of weather meant death by exposure and respiratory failure. The settlement hunkered down, burning whatever could be burned, eating whatever could be eaten, and dying in numbers that the daily mortality reports listed with bureaucratic precision. When the storm cleared, I noticed something that would fundamentally alter my understanding of what we were doing at Silo 7. I was performing perimeter inspection, a routine patrol around the outer wire, checking for damage or breach attempts, when I saw the tithe ship schedule posted on the administrative notice board near the command post. The board displayed operational information for guard personnel, shift rotations, ammunition allocation, maintenance schedules, and cargo transport timelines. The next tithe ship was scheduled to arrive in orbit in 47 days. Standard protocol called for grain transport to begin immediately upon arrival, with full cargo holds being lifted to the waiting void ship over a period of approximately 10 days. I'd seen this process before. Massive cargo haulers landing at the silo complexes, loading grain by the thousands of tons, then launching back to orbit in thunderous columns of fire and exhaust. What caught my attention was the simple mathematical discrepancy between the posted schedule and reality. We were killing people every day to protect grain reserves, operating under the assumption that the tithe ships arrived on unpredictable schedules, and we needed to maintain maximum security at all times. But the schedule showed clear patterns. Ships arrived every 120 days with minimal variation. The next ship after this one would arrive in 4 months, the one after that 4 months later. I did the arithmetic in my head. The current reserves in Silo 7 alone, one of 43 identical facilities, could fill a tithe ship's cargo hold 3 times over. The combined reserves across all silos represented enough food to fill 12 ships, but only 1 ship was coming in the next 4 months, which meant we were sitting on approximately 2 years' worth of grain exports while the population starved, protecting reserves that wouldn't be loaded onto ships for years to come. We weren't guarding the current tithe. We were guarding future tithes, reserve stocks, strategic supplies meant to ensure the Imperium could extract its due regardless of local production fluctuations. The administratum had calculated that maintaining maximum reserve levels was more important than keeping the local population alive. Every person we killed was protecting grain that wouldn't leave the planet for years, that could have fed the settlements today, but was instead being hoarded against potential future shortfalls. The cruelty of it was so pure, so perfectly optimized, that I stood staring at that schedule board for 15 minutes, my mind struggling to process the full implications. My father had died protecting grain that was sitting idle. Grevin had been murdered to maintain reserve stocks that exceeded immediate requirements by several orders of magnitude. I'd killed dozens of people to guard food that would remain in these silos for years, while the population that grew it died within sight of its storage. I wanted to tear the schedule board down, to carry it into the settlement and show everyone the truth, that the immediate scarcity was artificial, created by policy rather than actual resource limitation. That there was enough grain in these silos to feed every person on this world for 6 months while we recovered from the blight. That we were being starved deliberately to maintain supply chain efficiency. But I did nothing, because I knew what would happen if I revealed that information. The crowds wouldn't come in hundreds anymore. They'd come in thousands, tens of thousands, overwhelming the guard forces through sheer numerical superiority. They'd breach the silos, take the grain, and distribute it themselves. And then the administratum would do exactly what Vecht had described, deploy the Arbites with heavy weapons and kill everyone within range, reclassifying the entire planet as rebellious and potentially deploying orbital assets to bombard the settlements into compliance. The system was designed so perfectly that even knowing the truth didn't provide any viable path to resistance. We were trapped in a logic loop where the only way to keep people alive was to kill them in measured quantities, protecting artificial scarcity that prevented greater slaughter. I returned to my post and said nothing. That night, I couldn't look at Joseph or my sons. They ate their rations with the contentment of people who believed the system was functioning as designed, protecting them while tragic but necessary sacrifices were made outside. They didn't know we were eating food that could have saved thousands, kept fresh in climate-controlled silos while people died of hunger less than a kilometer away. Petir had learned a new catechism prayer in his educational instruction. He recited it proudly over the evening meal. The Emperor provides for his faithful servants. Those who serve are rewarded. Those who fail in service are unworthy of his provision. The faithful prosper while the unworthy perish, for such is his divine justice. The theology was perfectly designed to justify resource inequality. If you were fed, it was because you deserved divine favor through loyal service. If you starved, it was because you'd failed to serve adequately. The system absolved itself of any moral responsibility by attributing outcomes to divine judgment rather than administrative policy. And they taught this to children, programming the next generation to accept inequality as cosmic justice rather than manufactured cruelty. I wanted to scream. Instead I said, "That's very good, Petir. You're learning well." Oh, Joseph smiled with pride. He's the top student in his instruction group. The teacher says he has real devotion. Devotion to lies, faith in a system designed to exploit that faith. But I smiled and praised my son because what alternative existed? Tell him the truth and watch his world collapse. Better to let him keep the comfortable delusion for now, while I bore the weight of knowledge alone. Month 11 brought the event that would complete my transformation from murderer to something worse than human. It started with a mechanical failure in the settlement's primary water processing facility. The plant had been operating at minimal capacity since the famine began. The administratum had reduced maintenance allocations to redirect resources toward tithe production systems. After months of deferred maintenance, a critical pump assembly seized, shutting down water distribution to approximately 40,000 people in the eastern residential blocks. Without water, people died faster than starvation could kill them. Dehydration killed in days rather than weeks. The settlement's emergency reserves, stored in small local tanks, lasted approximately 36 hours before being exhausted. After that, people had no choice but to seek water from the only reliable sources still functioning: the silo complexes, which maintained their own independent water systems for fire suppression and climate control. They came at dawn on the third day of the water crisis. Not hundreds this time, thousands. A mass of humanity that stretched across the entire eastern approach, moving slowly but inexorably towards Silo 7. I stood at my post and watched them come, knowing we didn't have enough ammunition to stop a crowd this size, knowing the administration's response would be catastrophic if they breached the perimeter. Vetched activated the loudspeaker system, his voice booming across the approach zone. "This is a secured Imperial facility. Water distribution is not authorized. Return to the settlement immediately. Arbeits units have been notified and are en route. Lethal force is authorized." The crowd didn't slow. At the front, I saw men carrying children on their shoulders, boys dying of thirst, their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes glassy with approaching death. Behind them, elderly men moved with the shuffling gait of total exhaustion, driven forward by the simple biological imperative to find water. "All stations, prepare to fire," Vect ordered through the Vox network. I raised my autogun, sighting down the barrel at the approaching mass. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't a standard crowd control situation. This was a survival stampede. If we broke them, thousands would die in the crush as people trampled each other trying to retreat. If we didn't break them, they'd overwhelm the wire through sheer numbers, and the Arbeits would deploy gas weapons that would kill everyone within a kilometer, including the protected zone where my family lived. Fire. 20 autoguns opened up simultaneously. The front ranks of the crowd went down like grain before harvester blades. Bodies piled up, creating barriers of corpses that the people behind had to climb over. We fired in sustained bursts, pouring thousands of rounds into the mass of humanity. The sound was apocalyptic. Automatic weapons fire mixed with screaming. The wet impact of rounds hitting flesh. The mechanical clicking of chargebacks being replaced. The crowd kept coming. They climbed over their own dead, driven by desperation that exceeded fear. They reached the outer wire and began tearing at it with bare hands, blood running down the fencing as the wire cut into their palms. Some had brought tools, lengths of pipe, pry bars, anything that could be used to damage the barrier. "They're breaching Sector 4, someone shouted through the Vox network. I turned to see a section of outer wire going down, pulled apart by dozens of hands working simultaneously. People poured through the gap, running toward the second barrier. We redirected fire, creating a killing zone in the breach, stacking bodies so high that forward movement became impossible. But other sections of wire were failing now, pulled down by the sheer weight of numbers pressing against it. "Arbeits ETA 3 minutes, Vecht said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "All personnel, fall back to inner perimeter. Prepare for gas deployment." We retreated to the final barrier, the reinforced fence that surrounded the silo itself, and the protected zone where our families lived. Behind this fence, I could see Yosef and other family members watching through the windows of the habitation units, their faces pressed to the glass, witnessing the slaughter. The crowd reached the second barrier and began the same assault, tearing at the wire with bleeding hands. They were close enough now that I could see individual faces, recognize features despite the deterioration of starvation. I saw former co-workers, men I'd shared rations with, fathers I'd known from the cultivation zones. And then I saw my brother, Thomas. I thought he was dead, recorded in the mortality reports 4 months ago. But he was alive, skeletal and barely recognizable, moving with the desperate energy of terminal dehydration. He was carrying a boy on his shoulders, my nephew, Marcus, who I'd last seen 2 years ago as a healthy 6-year-old. Now he was a dying skeleton, his head lolling against Thomas's neck, his lips crusted with dried blood. "Thomas!" I screamed his name, lowering my weapon. "Thomas, get back! The Arbeits are coming, they'll kill everyone!" He saw me, recognized me through the degradation and desperation. His expression twisted into something beyond hatred, a look of absolute betrayal and condemnation. "You," he shouted, his voice raw. "You did this. You protected food while we died. You murdered your own people. Marcus is dying, Matthias. Dying, and you're standing there with a full belly, protecting grain you'll never eat." "I can't help you," I said, the words tearing out of my throat. "If you breach this fence, they'll kill everyone. My family, your family, everyone." "Your family is already dead," Thomas snarled. "We're all dead. You just haven't admitted it yet." He set Marcus down carefully, then picked up a length of pipe someone had dropped. He moved toward the fence with murder in his eyes, not trying to reach the silo anymore, trying to reach me, trying to beat me to death through the wire for my complicity in his son's death. I raised my autogun. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. This was my brother, the person I'd grown up beside, learned to work beside, shared every childhood memory with, and I was going to kill him. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I pulled the trigger, center mass, controlled burst. Thomas jerked backward, the pipe falling from his hands, blood spreading across his chest. He collapsed next to Marcus, reaching for his son with the last of his strength, his hand falling just short. Something inside me died with him, some essential piece of humanity that had survived 11 months of murder. I'd killed strangers, I'd killed friends, now I'd killed family. The transformation was complete. I wasn't human anymore. I was a function of the system, a tool that killed on command without regard for connection or conscience. The Arbites arrived in armored transports, deploying in a perimeter around the silo complex. They wore full-sealed suits with external respirators, carrying heavy weapons and gas dispersal canisters. Their commander, a massive figure in carapace armor decorated with the administrative seal, assessed the situation and made his determination in less than 30 seconds. Mass suppression authorized. Clear the protected personnel to sealed quarters. We were ordered inside, sealing ourselves in the barracks, while the Arbites deployed their gas weapons. Through the reinforced windows, I watched them fire canisters into the crowd, projectiles that burst on impact, releasing clouds of yellowish vapor that hung in the still air. People began dropping within seconds, convulsing as the nerve agent attacked their respiratory systems. Within 2 minutes, the entire crowd was down. Thousands of bodies sprawled across the approach zones and piled against the wire. The gas dissipated after 10 minutes. The Arbites performed a sweep, executing anyone still showing signs of life with precise bolt pistol shots. Then they called in the recovery teams, massive cargo haulers that scooped bodies by the hundreds and transported them to the processing facilities. My brother and nephew were among them, loaded into a truck with hundreds of other corpses, on their way to become protein components in corpse starch rations. I would probably eat them eventually, their rendered flesh distributed as standard rations. My family literally consuming my family in the perfect closed loop of imperial resource efficiency. The water crisis was resolved 3 days later when the administratum redirected resources to repair the processing facility. They'd always had the capacity to fix it. They'd simply waited to see if the crisis would resolve through population reduction first. Cheaper to let people die than to expedite repairs. The mathematics of oppression calculated down to the individual calorie. I returned to duty the next day. I performed my functions. I killed when ordered. I maintained my weapon. I ate my rations. I interacted with my family. But I was no longer present in any meaningful sense. The person named Matthias Keln had died when he murdered his brother. What remained was a biological machine that performed guard functions, a collection of reflexes and conditioning that happened to inhabit a body that looked human. Yosef noticed the change. "You've been different since the gas deployment," he said one evening, studying my face with concern. "You barely speak. You don't touch your food. What happened out there?" "Nothing," I said. "Just another breach attempt. Standard suppression. The children are asking questions. They saw the gas from the windows. Patir had nightmares. He wants to know if we're safe. We're safe, I said, the words automatic. The Emperor protects the faithful. I'd started using the propaganda phrases reflexively, not because I believed them, but because they were easier than truth. They ended conversations. They provided comfortable lies that allowed people to stop asking difficult questions. I understood now why the administratum distributed these phrases so widely. They were conversational kill switches, designed to terminate critical thinking and replace it with rote acceptance. Yosef seemed satisfied with the answer. He stopped asking questions. Patir's nightmares faded after a week of reassurance and prayer. The system had mechanisms for processing trauma too. Religious rituals that attributed suffering to divine will rather than human policy, making horror acceptable by framing it as cosmic necessity. Month 12 arrived with the tithe ship. I stood at my post and watched it descend from orbit, a massive vessel kilometers long that moved with the ponderous grace of something too large to be affected by planetary gravity. It settled into a landing zone 5 kilometers from the silo complex, crushing several abandoned hab blocks under its landing struts. The roar of its engines rattled my bones even at this distance. Cargo transports began the loading process immediately, forming a convoy between the silos and the ship. Each transport carried approximately 50 tons of grain, loaded from the silos through automated systems that measured and sealed the cargo without human intervention. The transports ran continuously for 9 days, lifting hundreds of thousands of tons from our reserves. I watched grain leave the planet while the settlement mortality rate exceeded 1,000 people per day. I watched cargo holds fill while children died of starvation within sight of the loading zones. I watched the tithe being met exactly as scheduled, while the population that produced it was systematically reduced to whatever level the administratum had calculated as optimal. The ship departed on schedule, its engines burning bright enough to illuminate the entire settlement as it climbed toward orbit. Somewhere in the Imperium, on worlds I would never see, people would eat the grain we'd protected. They would never know its cost, never know that every ton represented dozens of dead, never know that their sustenance was purchased with systematic murder. The reserves in Silo 7 were reduced by approximately 30%. Still far more than the settlement needed to survive, still protected by armed guards who killed anyone who approached. The system continued without interruption. I received a commendation for my service during the water crisis. Vecht presented it during a formal ceremony attended by all guard personnel, a small metal pin bearing the administratum seal, accompanied by a certificate that praised my exemplary service under crisis conditions and dedication to duty despite personal cost. The certificate was signed by officials I'd never meet, people who made policy from climate-controlled offices and never witnessed its implementation. I accepted the commendation without comment. It weighed nothing, meant nothing, changed nothing. That night, I made a decision. I went to the armory during my off-shift hours and requested additional ammunition, claiming I wanted to perform extended weapon maintenance training. The armorer, a tired man who'd processed thousands of such requests, issued me 3 full charge packs without question. I took them back to my bunk and loaded one into my autogun. I put the barrel under my chin and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. I squeezed again. Click. The weapon was jammed. I cleared the mechanism, reloaded, tried again. Same result. The autogun I'd maintained perfectly for 12 months, that had never failed in combat, suddenly wouldn't fire. I tried the second charge pack. Same result. The third, still nothing. I realized what had happened. The armorer had issued me dud packs, ammunition that had been cycled through weapons training so many times it had degraded below functionality. Standard procedure was to mark these packs for disposal, but instead, they were being reissued to save resources. I'd been given defective ammunition, and my suicide attempt had failed because the administratum was too cheap to provide functional equipment even for that. I started laughing. Hysterical, broken laughter that turned into sobbing. I couldn't even kill myself efficiently. The system had colonized even that choice, turning it into another expression of resource scarcity. Yosef found me in the barracks, surrounded by disassembled weapon parts and empty charge packs, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Matthias, what are you doing?" He pulled me to my feet, genuine fear in his voice. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said, the laughter dying. "Nothing is wrong. Everything is exactly as it should be. The Emperor protects. The tithe is met. The system functions perfectly. You're scaring me. Should I call the medical officer?" No. I pulled myself together, forcing my face into something resembling normal composure. "I'm fine. Just tired. I'll sleep now." He helped me to my bunk, covering me with a thin blanket, his hand lingering on my shoulder with concern I no longer deserved. He cared about me, loved me, in whatever way we'd constructed between us, and I was already dead, just waiting for my body to acknowledge it. I lay in the darkness and realized suicide wasn't an option anymore. The system had removed that escape route through simple logistical failure. I was trapped inside my own body, inside my own complicity, inside a system that would continue using me until my biological components failed. The only path forward was to continue, to keep killing, to keep eating, to keep existing in this liminal state between life and death, human and function, person and tool. Month 13 brought administrative restructuring. The administratum, analyzing casualty reports and population projections, determined that the current mortality rate would reduce the settlement population below minimum viability within 8 months. They needed to preserve enough people to maintain basic cultivation operations for the next growing season, which meant reducing the starvation rate to sustainable levels. Their solution was elegant and horrible. Expand the Hunger Guard program. Double the guard force, which meant double the protected families, which meant more people receiving full rations. The mathematics worked perfectly. Feed the enforcers and their families, which created a fed class large enough to stabilize population decline, while maintaining the security apparatus that protected the tithe. They recruited 300 new guards from the remaining workforce population, offering the same false choice I'd accepted. Watch your family die, or become a murderer and maybe save them. Every recruit made the same calculation I had. Everyone chose murder over loss. The guard force expanded from 20 men at Silo 7 to 50. The protected zone grew correspondingly, now housing over 200 people, guards and their families, living in relative security while maintaining the killing line that kept thousands outside. I was promoted to shift supervisor, a position that came with increased rations and better quarters. Yosef and my sons moved into a 2-room habitation unit with private sanitation. Petir and Mikhail attended a proper educational facility where they learned advanced catechisms and basic imperial history, being programmed for potential future service as minor administrative functionaries or technical specialists. My family was prospering. My sons were healthy, educated, and safe, and I paid for it with the lives of people who could have been them if my arithmetic had been slightly different. I trained the new recruits personally, teaching them the techniques I'd perfected over a year of murder: target acquisition, fire discipline, emotional detachment, proper maintenance rituals. I watched their faces during their first live-fire incident, seeing the same horror and realization I'd experienced, watching them cross the same threshold where they stopped being people and became tools. "It gets easier," I told them afterward, repeating the lie Vecht had told me. "You learn to separate duty from emotion, focus on the function, not the individual." It never got easier. It got more mechanical, more automatic, more divorced from conscious thought. But the weight never decreased. Every kill added to the accumulation, building a psychological mass that pressed down constantly, deforming everything it touched. Year 2 began with the harvest season. The cultivation zones had recovered somewhat from the blight. Aggressive burning and crop rotation had reduced fungal infection rates to manageable levels. The new crop was smaller than historical averages, but significantly better than last year's near-total failure. The massive harvesters moved across the grain seas, processing stalks and producing food bricks at industrial scale. The administratum calculated the new yield and adjusted quotas accordingly. The tithe requirement remained unchanged. Void ships would arrive on schedule and expect their holds filled regardless of local conditions. But the improved harvest meant slightly more grain remained for local consumption. The settlement's ration allocation increased from near zero to approximately 800 calories per person per day. Not enough to thrive, barely enough to survive, but better than active starvation. The crowds at the wire decreased in size and frequency. People could eat just enough to continue working, which meant the cultivation workforce could be maintained at functional levels. The mortality rate dropped from over 1,000 per day to approximately 200. Still horrific, still a slow bleeding of the population, but sustainable from the administratum's perspective. I stood watch over grain that was less desperately needed, killing people whose desperation was slightly less acute. The moral calculus hadn't changed, only the intensity. I was still a murderer. The system still functioned through systematic violence, but the scale had decreased to levels the administratum considered optimal. Year 3 brought the full horror of my eternal role into focus. I'd been serving as hunger guard for 28 months, training new recruits, supervising shifts, participating in hundreds of security actions. My body had adapted to the work. I could sight and fire without conscious thought, could assess crowd psychology instantly, could predict breach attempts before they developed. I'd become expert at murder through sheer repetition, and then I realized this was permanent. This wasn't temporary crisis assignment. This was my function for the rest of my life. The administratum had created a permanent enforcer class, fed and housed specifically to maintain the security apparatus that protected the tithe. I would spend decades standing at this wire, killing my own people, protecting grain that would be exported while controlled starvation kept the local population at optimal working levels. My sons would grow up inside the wire, educated and fed, conditioned to see their privilege as earned rather than purchased with blood. They would probably enter administratum service themselves, becoming part of the system that had consumed their grandfather and uncle. The cycle would perpetuate through generations, creating a hereditary enforcer class separated from the general population by nothing more than their willingness to kill on command. I understood then that I would never escape. Suicide wasn't possible. The system controlled access to functional weapons and monitored personnel for signs of psychological breakdown. Desertion wasn't possible. Where would I go? Outside the wire meant starvation. There was no escape from this planet, no way to reach anywhere the Imperium's machinery didn't function identically. I was trapped in my role, trapped in my complicity, trapped in a system that would use me until my body failed and then process my remains into rations for the next generation of murderers. The full weight of eternal horror settled into my consciousness and never lifted. I was aware every moment that I was damned. Not in the religious sense. I'd long since stopped believing in divine judgment or cosmic justice. But damned in the practical sense, I would spend the rest of my existence as an instrument of oppression, fully conscious of what I was doing, unable to stop, unable to escape, unable even to die on my own terms. I continued functioning. What other choice existed? Year 4 brought the second tithe ship, arriving exactly on schedule. We loaded grain while people starved. The system perpetuated. The ship departed. The reserves were replenished. The cycle continued. Year 5 brought a new generation of children inside the wire. Sons born to guards, raised in the protected zone, conditioned from infancy to see their privilege as normal. Petya, now 14, began basic weapons training, preparing to join the guard force when he reached age 16. He was proud, excited to serve. He'd been taught that guards were defenders of imperial order, that we protected vital resources from criminals and traitors who wanted to sabotage the tithe. He had no idea he was being programmed to murder his own people. No awareness that the criminals beyond the wire were just starving workers whose only crime was being born outside the protected zone. He believed the propaganda completely, having lived inside it his entire formative life. I watched my son prepare to become me, and I couldn't warn him, couldn't tell him the truth. Because the truth would destroy him, and I'd destroyed enough people already. Year 7 brought plague, a disease vector that spread through the malnourished population outside the wire, killing thousands in weeks. The administratum's response was to quarantine the entire settlement, preventing any movement between residential blocks. Guard patrols shot anyone attempting to cross quarantine boundaries, adding disease control to our list of functions. The plague burned itself out after killing approximately 40,000 people, 10% of the remaining settlement population. The bodies were processed as usual. The system adapted and continued. Year 9 brought my final transformation. A shift occurred somewhere in my consciousness, a fundamental reorganization of how I processed reality. The guilt and horror that had defined my internal experience gradually dissolved, replaced by something colder and more terrible. Acceptance. I accepted what I was. I accepted what I did. I accepted the system and my role in it, not through conscious choice or moral compromise, but through simple psychological exhaustion. The human mind cannot maintain crisis-level emotional response for a decade. Eventually, the abnormal becomes normal. The horrible becomes routine. The unacceptable becomes accepted through sheer duration. I stopped feeling anything when I killed. Not satisfaction, not horror, not even the mechanical detachment I'd cultivated earlier. Just nothing. Pure function. Target appears. Assess threat level. Fire if necessary. Next target. My consciousness operated like an automated targeting system, processing inputs and generating appropriate responses without emotional content. Yosef noticed I'd changed again, become even more distant than before. But he'd given up trying to reach me years ago. We coexisted in the same quarters, raising our sons through their teenage years, performing the social rituals of partnership without any genuine connection. He'd probably given up on me as a person, choosing to focus on the children and his own survival. Pete here joined the Guard force at 16, as expected. I trained him personally, teaching him everything I knew, watching him learn to kill with the same efficiency I'd mastered. He was good at it. Natural aptitude for threat assessment and fire discipline. He would probably be promoted to supervisor within a few years, continuing the family tradition of sanctioned murder. I felt nothing watching him become what I was. Not pride, not horror, not grief. Just recognition that the cycle was perpetuating exactly as designed. Year 12 brought administrative reforms. The administratum, analyzing decades of data from agricultural worlds throughout the sector, determined that Agri-World Secundus Theta's model of managed starvation and permanent enforcer class was optimally efficient. They exported the model to 14 other worlds, creating a standardized system of tithe protection that balanced population control with resource extraction. Our suffering had been so successful, it became template policy. The murders I'd committed were now best practices, documented in administrative manuals and taught to Guard forces across multiple star systems. My role had been abstracted into procedural guidelines, my individual complicity dissolved into institutional function. I received another commendation for my 12 years of exemplary service. This time I didn't even feel the bitter irony. Just filed the certificate with the others and returned to duty. Year 15 brought the realization that I'd become eternal in a practical sense. Not immortal, my body was aging, my joints stiffening, my vision degrading slightly, but eternal in function. I'd stood at this wire for so long that I'd become inseparable from it. My identity had merged with my role so completely that I couldn't remember who Matthias Keln had been before he became Hunger Guard Supervisor Keln. The person who'd maintained irrigation systems felt like a character from a story I'd read rather than someone I'd been. The father who'd made desperate arithmetic to save his sons was a stranger wearing my memories. The man who'd killed his brother had become so distant that I could barely recall the emotion of that moment. I was Guard Supervisor Keln. That was my entire identity. Everything else had been overwritten. Year 17 brought catastrophic system failure. A massive dust storm, worse than any in recorded planetary history, buried the settlement under 3 meters of particulate matter. The storm lasted 40 days, destroying infrastructure, contaminating water supplies, and killing thousands through respiratory failure and structural collapse. When the storm cleared, the settlement was devastated. 70% of the habitation units were destroyed. The surviving population had dropped below critical sustainability thresholds. The administratum performed calculations and made their determination. Agri-world Secundus Theta was no longer viable for continued agricultural production. The planet would be abandoned. Evacuation ships arrived in orbit, massive void barges designed for bulk personnel transport. They began lifting the surviving population, prioritizing technical specialists and administrative personnel. The agricultural workers, the people who'd actually grown the grain, were classified as low priority and placed on waiting lists that everyone knew would never be fulfilled. The guard force, classified as administrative security personnel, received priority evacuation status. My family was placed on the manifest for immediate departure. I stood at the wire watching the general population gather at evacuation checkpoints, watching them be turned away, watching them realize they were being abandoned to die on this devastated world. The administratum had extracted everything useful and was now discarding the human components like worn equipment. "We're leaving," Joseph said, relief evident in his voice. "We survived, Matthias. We actually survived." I looked at him and realized he genuinely believed we'd been fortunate, that our survival was reward for loyalty rather than the result of our willingness to murder people like him. He'd been inside the wire so long he'd forgotten, or chosen to forget, that the only difference between us and the people being abandoned was which side of the fence we'd stood on. "Yes," I said. "We survived." We boarded the evacuation ship 3 days later. As we lifted from the planet's surface, I looked through the viewport at the settlement below. Thousands of people still gathering at checkpoints, still believing they might be saved, still trusting the system that had exploited them would somehow deliver them. The ship sealed its cargo holds and prepared for transit to the void. I never saw them again. But I know what happened. The administratum doesn't waste resources on mercy. They were left to die either from starvation or exposure or eventual systems collapse. Hundreds of thousands of people abandoned because the cost of evacuation exceeded their calculated value to the Imperium. We arrived at a new world 3 months later. Another agricultural planet with the same cultivation zones, the same massive grain seas, the same settlements full of workers who would eventually face the same mathematics I'd lived through. I was assigned to Silo 41 as guard supervisor, training a new force to protect grain while populations starved. The cycle continued, the system perpetuated. I performed my function. 23 years later, my name was Matthias Keln. I am 68 years old. I have served as Hunger Guard supervisor for 40 years across 4 different agricultural worlds. I have trained over 300 guards in the techniques of systematic murder. I have personally killed. I stopped counting after the first 1,000. The number is meaningless, large enough to be abstract. I stand at the wire of Silo 41 on AgriWorld Tertius, watching another crowd approach. They're thinner than usual. This world is in year 4 of a managed famine, and the population is being reduced to optimal levels. I recognize this pattern. I've seen it before. I'll see it again. The crowd reaches the outer barrier and begins the familiar assault. Hands gripping wire, voices calling for mercy. Children held up to generate sympathy. They don't know it's all been calculated. That their approach pattern, their emotional appeals, their desperation have all been documented in administrative manuals as expected behavior during resource stress events. I activate the loudspeaker system. My voice booms across the approach zone with the words I've spoken thousands of times. This is a secured Imperial facility. Unauthorized approach is forbidden. Return to the settlement immediately or face lethal response. They don't return. They never do. I signal to my subordinates, including my son Petir, now 34 years old and senior guard at this facility. He's excellent at his job. No hesitation, no moral confusion, pure function. He's better at this than I ever was. All stations, Prepare to fire. I order through the Vox network. 20 autoguns rise to firing positions. I sight down my barrel at a man holding a boy. The scene is so familiar, it's like looking at a photograph I've seen before. Everything repeats. Every world, every famine, every crowd. The Imperium functions through cycles of exploitation that perpetuate identically across thousands of planets. Fire. The autoguns roar. Bodies fall. The crowd breaks. The recovery teams are already en route to process the corpses. Within hours, the area will be clear, ready for the next incident. I lower my weapon and perform the post-engagement check. Ammunition expenditure, acceptable. Casualty ratio, optimal. No wire breaches. Mission successful. I feel nothing. No satisfaction, no horror, no fatigue. Just the recognition that I've performed my function adequately and will perform it again tomorrow. Joseph died 6 years ago. Systemic organ failure from decades of standard rations. Petier has 2 sons of his own now, being raised inside the wire, being conditioned for eventual guard service. The cycle perpetuates through generations. Mikhail, my younger son, died in a training accident at age 19. His body was processed according to standard protocols. I ate him eventually, unable to identify his specific proteins among the standard rations, but knowing statistically he was in there somewhere. I've consumed my family, my friends, my entire world, repeatedly across multiple planets. The Imperium's resource efficiency is perfect. Nothing is wasted, everything is recycled, everyone eventually becomes food for everyone else in the closed system of its exploitation. I've outlasted almost everyone I've killed. The arithmetic of survival inside the wire means I've eaten better, lived longer, and functioned more efficiently than the thousands who died beyond it. My reward for 40 years of murder is continued existence in a role I can never escape. I cannot die. I've tried 3 more times over the decades, always with the same result: system failure, defective equipment, or intervention that prevented completion. The Imperium needs my expertise, my experience, my 40 years of refined killing technique. I'm too valuable to be allowed to die until my biological components fail naturally. I will stand at this wire for another decade, possibly 2 if my health holds. I will train more guards. I will kill more people. I will protect grain that feeds worlds I'll never see, while populations that grew it die within sight of its storage. And when I finally die, my body will be processed into rations. Some guard will eat me, consuming my proteins to fuel his own service in the same role. The cycle is perfect, eternal, consuming itself forever. The Imperium they edged was built on the Emperor's divine protection. They claimed he watched over his faithful servants, rewarded loyalty, and delivered justice to the worthy. These were lies designed to make us complicit in our own exploitation. There is no protection, no divine plan, no cosmic justice. There is only the machinery of extraction, operating with perfect efficiency, grinding human beings into resources that fuel its continued operation. We are components, functions, tools that kill on command and process our own dead into fuel. I accepted this decades ago. I stopped fighting, stopped questioning, stopped feeling. I am Hunger Guard Supervisor Matthias Kelm. I am a function of the Imperium. I will continue until I stop. The crowd is dispersing. The recovery teams are loading bodies. Tomorrow there will be another crowd, and I will kill them too. This is what it means to be a Hunger Guard on a famine world in Warhammer 40,000. This is eternal. This is all there is. This is all there ever was. My name is Matthias Kelm. I guard the grain while the world starves. I always will.